I am Maynard Hutchkins, and I sold the very earth my mother was buried in to buy my wife a miracle that turned out to be a $5 million heist. I bankrupted my life to save her from a cancer that didn't exist, only for her to stand up, perfectly healthy, and laugh while she stripped me of my home and my children. She called me a pathetic dreamer, but she forgot one thing. I'm an architect, and I'm about to deconstruct her lie piece by bloody piece until the whole house collapses on her head. To understand the fire, you have to see the moment the first match was struck. The memory hits me like a physical blow, pulling me out of my basement and dragging me back through time, back into the sterile trap where the light was golden and the betrayal was still a secret. The air in the private medical suite was thin, filtered through expensive vents until it lost the scent of the Georgia pines outside. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the historic squares of Savannah. Down there, the moss-draped oaks stood like silent sentinels, guarding secrets older than the Hutchkins name itself. My brothers, Fergus and Alistair, always looked at trees as lumber or land value. But as a landscape architect, I saw them as a legacy, something that takes a century to grow and only a second to fell. I wondered if anyone has ever asked you what you would trade for one more day with the person you love. We all like to think we know the answer until the bill actually arrives. The rhythmic, artificial beep of the heart monitor sliced through the silence, a metronome for a life I was desperate to keep in rhythm. Behind me, the clinical scent of antiseptic fought a losing battle against the faint, lingering notes of Vespera's jasmine perfume. It was a beautiful smell, the kind that reminded me of our first date at Forsyth Park. I reached into my pocket and felt the worn leather of my sketchbook. I am Maynard Hutchkins, the youngest son, the one they called the dreamer. To my family, I was always the weak link because I valued the curve of a garden path over the digits on a balance sheet. But standing in that room, I realized that my career, my drawings, and every garden I had ever planted were small prices to pay for the breath in Vespera's lungs. True strength isn't found in what you hold on to. It's found in what you are willing to let go of to save the person who anchors your soul. I turned away from the window as the door opened with a soft, predatory hiss. Dr. Garrick entered, carrying a heavy leather-bound folder like it was a holy relic. His face was a mask of calculated empathy, the kind doctors wear when they're about to ask for the impossible. He spoke about aggressive interventions and experimental protocols that insurance wouldn't touch. He told me the Magnolia land, the last piece of ancestral earth I owned, was the only currency fast enough to buy the time Vespera didn't have. I felt a cold knot tighten in my chest. That land wasn't just dirt, it was the Hutchkins bloodline. My brothers had already sold their shares of the family heritage, but I had held on, promised to keep it for the next generation. Yet, looking at the pale, fragile woman in that bed, I knew that land is just dust, while a life is a sacred masterpiece that cannot be rebuilt. Vespera stirred, her pale hand trembling as she reached out for mine. Her eyes were watery, reflecting a vulnerability that tore through my last defenses. "Maynard," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "I don't want to leave you alone in this world. I'm so scared of the dark." Her words felt like a physical weight, pressing the air from my lungs. I felt the eyes of Dr. Garrick on me, waiting for the architect to fold. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my mother's vintage fountain pen. It was a heavy, gold-nibbed instrument I had saved only for my most important designs. I didn't hesitate. I signed the transfer deeds, the workshop titles, and the Magnolia estate away with a hand that didn't shake. I thought I was buying her a future. I didn't realize I was merely paying for my own erasure. When I handed the documents back to Garrick, a strange, hollow peace settled over me. It was the quiet honor of a man who has lost everything but kept his word. My brothers would call me a fool, but they never understood that you can't take the land with you when you die, but you can take the knowledge that you did everything for love. I walked to the side of the bed and leaned down, kissing Vespera's forehead. "I didn't do this for the land or the family name, Vespera," I said softly. "I did it because love doesn't count the cost. It only knows how to give until it's empty." I felt a sense of dignity in my poverty, believing that a true foundation isn't made of stone, but of the integrity you keep when the world tries to break you. I needed air, I told Vespera I was going to get a glass of water, my mind already drifting to how I would explain this to my father, Judge Athelstan. As I stepped into the hallway, the heavy door began to swing shut behind me. For a split second, I saw their reflection in the polished glass of a framed medical certificate. Vespera wasn't looking at the ceiling in pain. She was sitting up, her face transformed. Gone was the fragility, replaced by a sharp, predatory smile. She looked at Garrick, and he looked back at her with an expression that wasn't clinical. It was triumphant. A chill raced down my spine, more piercing than the hospital's air conditioning. I watched the shadow of the man I used to be vanish into the long, white hallway, never realizing that the woman I just saved was already planning my funeral. Looking back now, I should have seen the cracks in the structure. We often ignore the rot in the foundation because we are too busy admiring the view from the window. I had spent my life designing landscapes that flourished, yet I had failed to see the thorns growing in my own home. I stood there, clutching a plastic cup of water, feeling the first tremor of a realization that would eventually burn my world to the ground. Have you ever felt that sudden, sickening shift in the air when you realize the person you'd die for is the one holding the knife? That's where it all started. The humid Savannah night hung heavy over the Hutchkins estate, thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the irony of celebration. 1 month had passed since Vespera's miraculous recovery, and tonight, the grand ballroom was a sea of crystal and silk. I stood on the periphery of the gala, a ghost haunting the very gardens I had spent 2 decades manicuring into perfection. The champagne bubbled in glasses held by the city's elite, funded by the sale of the Magnolia land, my inheritance, my soul. I adjusted the sleeves of my suit, the fabric frayed and tight, a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding me. Have you ever felt like a stranger in your own home, watching people toast to a victory that was built on your bones? I watched the crowd, my mind drifting to the Stoic philosophy that charity is not a transaction, but a test of the giver's soul. I had justified my bankruptcy as a necessary sacrifice, a small price to pay for the breath in my wife's lungs. But as I observed the sparkling diamonds around Vespera's neck, jewelry I was certain I had pawned to pay for her bone marrow stimulants, the first cold seed of doubt began to sprout. She moved through the room with a predator's grace, her skin glowing with a health that seemed impossible for someone who was supposedly at death's door weeks ago. I attempted to reach for her hand as she glided past, hoping for a shared look of gratitude. Instead, she adjusted her silk shawl and drifted away, her eyes as cold and professional as a stranger's. It was a subtle erasure, the kind that hurts more than a physical blow. Looking back now, I should have seen the silence for what it was, a preparation for the kill. The evening reached its crescendo under the massive crystal chandelier. The chatter died down as Vespera took the small stage, the light catching the sharp angles of her face. I stood near the back, expecting a heartfelt tribute to the family's resilience. Instead, she gripped the microphone and looked out over the audience with a chillingly calm resolve. "I have spent the last year fighting for my life," she began, her voice steady and practiced. And in that darkness, I realized that some weights are too heavy to carry into the light. Tonight, I am announcing my liberation from a marriage that suffocated my potential, and a man whose reckless financial decisions nearly destroyed this family's legacy. A collective gasp rippled through the room. My heart thudded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I watched as my older brothers, Fergus and Alistair, stepped onto the stage to stand beside her. There was no hesitation in their movements, no flicker of sibling loyalty in their eyes. Vespera looked directly at me, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that carried to every corner of the ballroom. "Maynard Hutchkins is a weak man," she declared, the words cutting through my dignity like a serrated blade. "He sold our ancestral land not out of love, but out of a cowardly inability to manage a future. He is unstable, financially ruined, and no longer a part of the Hutchkins name." The public execution was complete. The room spun, the faces of my neighbors blurring into a mask of judgment. I felt the weight of every eye on me, wondering how a man could give everything and still be branded a thief of his own destiny. Fergus and Alistair descended the stairs and approached me, their faces set in grim masks of duty. They didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. Instead, Alistair produced a heavy manila envelope, a pre-signed no trespass order, and Fergus dropped a single, battered suitcase at my feet. "It's over, Maynard," Fergus said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You've become a liability. We've legally assumed the remaining interests of the estate. You have 10 minutes to leave the property." I looked at them, the two men who had shared my childhood table, and for a moment, I felt a profound pity. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I stood tall, my voice clear despite the wreckage of my life. "Family is a foundation built on truth, Fergus," I said quietly. "It's not a structure maintained by lies. If you tear down the foundation to save the roof, the whole house eventually falls. You think you've saved the name, but you've only preserved a corpse." I turned toward the hallway, desperate to see Rhett and Alara, to tell them that their father hadn't abandoned them. But Alistair blocked the path, his large frame a barrier between me and my children. "The court has issued a temporary restraining order," he said, his voice a sharp legal instrument. "Your instability is a threat to their development, Maynard. Vespera has full custody. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." In that moment, the trap snapped shut. I realized that every document I had signed in that hospital room, the power of attorney, the property transfers, had been weaponized. I was a man with no home, no money, and now, no children. I had been erased from my own life with the stroke of my mother's pen. I picked up the suitcase, the handle cold and slick in my grip. I walked out of the estate and into the pouring rain, the heavy iron gates slamming shut behind me with a hollow, final thud. The water soaked through my thin suit, but I barely felt it. I recalled a quote my father once told me: "The hardest winter is not the one that freezes the ground, but the one that freezes the hearts of those you loved." I stood on the sidewalk, the muddy water of Savannah swirling around my shoes. I had been excluded, humiliated, and cast out by the very people I would have died to protect. But as I stood there, a strange, icy clarity began to replace the shock. I wasn't just a victim, I was a witness, and a witness who has lost everything has nothing left to fear. The lights of the estate flickered in the distance, a dying star in my rearview mirror. Just as I turned to walk toward the bus stop, a sleek black sedan pulled into the driveway. Through the rain-streaked window of the car, I saw Dr. Garrick at the wheel. As the car slowed near the gates, I watched him reach across the center console. His hand didn't rest on Vespera's shoulder in a clinical gesture of support. It rested intimately on her waist, pulling her closer as they both looked at the iron gates I had just passed through. They weren't mourning a tragedy. They were celebrating a heist. I stood in the mud, watching the lights of my own home flicker out, unaware that the darkness was about to become my only ally. Have you ever reached the point where the pain is so sharp it actually cuts through the fog? That's the moment I stopped being the dreamer and started being the architect of their downfall. The transition from the grand halls of the Hutchkins estate to a cramped basement on the edge of Savannah felt like falling down a well in slow motion. I sat on a sagging mattress, the air thick with the smell of mildew and the relentless hum of old pipes. Rainwater streaked the single, high window, distorting the world outside into a series of gray, unrecognizable shapes. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the only thing Vespera hadn't managed to take, a crumpled photo of Rhett and Alara. Looking at their smiles, I realized my existence had been effectively deleted from the family archives. I wasn't just a bankrupt man. I was a ghost whose name had been scrubbed from the very walls I once designed. Have you ever stood in the wreckage of your own life and wondered if you were ever really there at all? I stared at the peeling wallpaper, reflecting on the stoic truth that a man's worth isn't found in the height of his roof, but in the depth of his foundation. When the storm strips the house bare, you finally see what you're made of. I spent my days working as a day laborer at the Savannah docks, my hands, once used to sketching elegant landscapes, now raw and blistered from hauling crates. I took comfort in the mechanical precision of my father's old drafting tools, which I kept in a small velvet-lined box. Every night, I would polish them with a rag, finding a strange peace in their cold, unyielding weight. My world outside was a chaotic mess of deception, but here in the dark, a straight line was still a straight line. I chose to go hungry most nights, sipping lukewarm water and counting every dollar. I wasn't just surviving, I was building a war chest. Every cent was a brick for the retainer of Alaric, the investigator my father, Judge Athelstan, had whispered about during our last secret meeting. I didn't realize it then, but that moment of hunger was the beginning of my clarity. The quiet of my basement was shattered 2 weeks later by a knock that sounded like a gavel. I was forced into a sterile, cold psychiatric evaluation room, a 72-hour hold orchestrated by Vespera. The legal maneuver was as brilliant as it was cruel, using my unstable behavior after the bankruptcy as grounds for an emergency mental health intervention. I sat across from a state evaluator, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry hornets. Dr. Garrick stood in the corner, his white coat a symbol of a purity he had long ago discarded. He spoke in a soft, concerned tone, presenting falsified psychological profiles that painted me as a man lost in manic financial delusions. He told the evaluator I was a danger to Rhett and Alara, a father who had traded their security for a dream that never existed. I felt the fury simmering beneath my skin, a hot, paternal rage that threatened to boil over. But I didn't yell. I didn't pound the table. I maintained eye contact with the evaluator, my voice calm and melodic. "Truth doesn't require an audience to be real," I said, the words echoing in the clinical silence. "But a lie requires a cage to keep its victim silent. I am not in this room because I am broken, doctor. I am here because I am the only one who knows where the bodies are buried." Garrick's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in his professional armor. Despite my composure, the legal machinery of Georgia moved with cold efficiency. Based on Garrick's expert testimony, the court awarded Vespera temporary full custody. They even slapped me with a garnishment order. 50% of my future earnings would go to her as restitution for the emotional distress I caused during her fictional cancer battle. I was being forced to fund the very woman who was systematically destroying me. I haven't been forgotten. I've been erased by the very law I was raised to respect. When the 72 hours were up, they released me back into the humid Savannah heat. I stood on the sidewalk, my legs shaky, feeling the weight of the city pressing down on me. Near the exit, I saw a homeless veteran sitting against the brick wall, his eyes hollow with a familiar kind of absence. Without thinking, I reached into my pocket and handed him my last $5 and the light jacket I was wearing. He looked at me with a confusion that mirrored my own. I did it because I needed to prove to myself that Vespera hadn't poisoned my spirit. She could take my house and my money, but she couldn't take my kindness. Looking back now, I see that moment as my true rebirth. You can only truly rebuild when you realize that your value isn't tied to what you own, but to what you are still willing to give. I made my way to a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town to meet Alaric. He was a man who looked like he was made of shadow and gravel, a Kudakvu IRS who knew how to follow the scent of blood through a paper trail. I didn't say much. I simply handed him a small, encrypted USB drive I had managed to snag from my home office before I was exiled. It contained the original blueprints for the hospital's electrical and layout system, blueprints I had studied during the treatment. I realized then that the greatest trick the devil ever played was making the world believe he didn't exist. But the greatest trick a good man can play is making his enemies believe he has already surrendered. I watched him plug the drive into a rugged laptop, the blue light reflecting in his eyes. Alaric scrolled through the files for what felt like hours, his brow furrowed in concentration. The diner was empty except for the sound of a distant jukebox and the occasional hiss of the fry cook's grill. He finally looked up at me, his voice a low whisper that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Maynard," he said, leaning across the cracked laminate table, "I've been looking at the billing cycles and the renovation permits you pulled. You weren't paying for her chemotherapy. Not a single cent went to an oncology pharmacy." He paused, tapping the screen where a specific floor plan was highlighted. "You were paying for the high-end renovation of a medical wing that technically doesn't exist on any city permit. It's a ghost wing, Maynard, and the doctor who signed off on it is currently listed as your wife's primary physician." I felt the room tilt. The air, which had been so heavy for months, suddenly felt sharp and cold. The surgeries, the experimental drugs, the nights of agony, they were all just line items on a contractor's invoice for a luxury suite hidden within the hospital's bowels. Vespera hadn't been fighting for her life. She had been decorating her future with my destruction. I stood up and walked back into the humid Savannah night, finally understanding that to rebuild my life, I first had to tear down the master architect of my ruin. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but for the first time in a long time, the darkness didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a blueprint. The humid Savannah night felt like a second skin as I stepped out of the shadows. I moved toward the downtown medical facility, my heart beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. This was a building I knew by heart, not just as a visitor, but as the architect who had consulted on its structural integrity 5 years ago. I knew every service entrance, every ventilation shaft, and every blind spot in the security grid. I wasn't the broken man who had huddled in a basement apartment anymore. Tonight, I was Maynard Hutchkins, the man who understood how a building breathes. I understood that a structure built on a lie doesn't need a hurricane to collapse. It only needs one person to look at the foundation with honest eyes. Looking back now, I should have seen the cracks in my own home long ago. I arrived at the high-tech facility, dressed in a night shift maintenance uniform, carrying a toolbox that felt heavier than it actually was. I bypassed the main lobby and slipped through the loading dock, moving through the service corridors with the silence of a ghost. The air here was recycled, tasting of metal and ozone. As I navigated toward the restricted surgical wing, I reflected on the irony of my situation. I had spent my life designing spaces for healing, yet I was now using that knowledge to uncover a terminal rot. A building has no choice but to be what it is. But humans? We are the only creatures that can build a palace out of thin air just to hide a grave. I didn't realize it then, but this was the first step toward reclaiming my name. I reached the double doors of Operating Room 402, the supposed site of Vespera's life-saving intervention. According to the medical bills I had bankrupted myself to pay, this room had been buzzing with emergency surgeons just 2 weeks prior. Instead, I found the doors locked with a heavy chain and a layer of dust on the handles. A yellow sign hung crookedly on the glass. Closed for renovation. September 15th. The date was 6 months old. There was no medical activity here, no miracle of science, just a hollow space behind a locked door. I felt a sickening shift in my stomach, the kind of visceral disgust you feel when you realize you've been mourning at an empty casket. I moved from the hospital to the downtown penthouse, the very home I had built with my own hands, and my grandfather's pride. I used a service key I had never surrendered, a piece of metal that felt like a hot coal in my pocket. I slipped inside, the scent of expensive lilies and floor wax flooding my senses. This was the place where my children were being taught to hate me. I moved through the familiar hallways, my footsteps silenced by the thick plush rugs I had picked out with Vespera. I found her in the master bedroom, the soft glow of the vanity lights illuminating a scene of quiet, domestic betrayal. She was preparing for bed, hummed a tune as she reached for the medical bandages wrapped around her midsection. I watched through the cracked door, my camera lens focused and steady. These were the bandages I had helped her change with trembling hands, weeping as I apologized for the pain she was enduring. As the fabric fell to the floor, I expected to see the jagged red scar of a radical oncology surgery. Instead, I saw flawless, unblemished skin. There were no incisions, no scalpel marks, not even a stitch. The skin I had sold my family's magnolia land to protect was now as perfect as porcelain doll skin. That was the most wonderful thing. Survival without a scar from a disease that never existed. Then I realized that scars are a map of survival, but someone without scars who claims to have walked through fire is simply a fire-crazed person who has never been burned. I retreated into the darkness of the hallway, my mind racing. I needed more. I needed the chemical proof of her deception. I found my way to the climate-controlled medical fridge in the kitchen, a high-end appliance I had installed to keep her specialized chemotherapy at the precise temperature. I opened it and saw the clear vials, each labeled with a price tag of $50,000, money I had bled from my children's college fund. I took one of the vials, the glass cold against my palm. I popped the cap and extracted a single drop, touching it to the tip of my tongue. It wasn't the metallic, bitter poison of cancer treatment. It was sugar, pure, sterile glucose water. I stood in the kitchen of the stolen house, a person erased but finally seen clearly. I had sold the land where my mother was buried to buy Vespera sugar water. I hadn't saved her life. I had only provided her with a vacation away from reality. I whispered her name into the empty space, a sound a mixture of deep pity and cold determination. I couldn't save you, Vespera. I only paid for the privilege of destruction. It was a bittersweet feeling that choked my throat, a realization that my love was the fuel for her cruelty. I didn't realize it then, but the architect within me was calculating how to shatter this roof. Suddenly, the front door's electronic lock chimed, a cheerful, digital melody that sounded like a funeral bell. I heard the unmistakable, booming laughter of Dr. Garrick echoing through the foyer. He wasn't speaking in his clinical, hushed tones anymore. He was bragging, his voice loud with the confidence of a man who had just cleared a massive wire transfer from the Hutchkins estate. He walked in, tossing his keys on the marble counter, his arm draped over Vespera's shoulder as she met him in the hall. They shared a look of triumphant glee, a pair of scavengers picking over the remains of a life I had worked 40 years to build. I slipped into the darkness of the ventilation shaft just as the lights flickered on, the metal pressing against my back. I stayed there, my breath shallow, listening to the sound of my own ruin being toasted with vintage crystal. They were talking about Bermuda, about accounts in the Cayman Islands, and about how Maynard, the dreamer, had been the easiest mark they ever found. Have you ever reached the point where the air feels like it's made of glass, and one more breath might shatter you? I didn't shatter. I became stone. I sat in that dark, cramped space, listening to their plans to take my children away forever. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew the man who went into that ventilation shaft wasn't the man who was coming out. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger on the truth. The humid Georgia night was a suffocating blanket pressing against the cracked windows of my basement apartment. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, the only light in the room coming from the dim amber glow of a signal receiver. I am Maynard Hutchkins, a man once defined by the gardens he created, now reduced to a silhouette in the dark, clutching a pair of headphones as if they were a lifeline. I had secretly delivered a handmade wooden music box for my daughter Ilara's 12th birthday. I carved it myself, using the last of the mahogany I had salvaged from my old workshop. It was a Trojan horse of paternal longing, containing a micro-transmitter hidden within the winding mechanism. I expected to hear her laughter, the sound of her small fingers tracing the wood, perhaps a whispered, "I miss you, Dad." Instead, the audio feed crackled to life with a sound that tore through my last shred of hope. The recording didn't capture a birthday party. It captured a board meeting of vultures. Vespera's voice, sharp and devoid of the melodic softness she used for the public, drifted through the static. She was in the master bedroom with Garrick, their intimacy dripping with predatory malice. I heard the unmistakable clinking of ice in crystal, my crystal. The fool actually cried when he handed over the deed. Vespera laughed, a jagged sound that felt like glass in my ears. He really thought he was saving me. He sold his own mother's burial plot, Garrick. Do you know what that paid for? This bag, this hand-stitched leather. He thinks it's chemo fund money, but it's just my new fall wardrobe. Garrick's voice followed, a low, oily chuckle. And the rest went straight to the offshore account. I've already cleared my markers with the house in Biloxi. Maynard isn't just a dreamer. He's the best investment we've ever made. I sat in the silence that followed, the headphones still vibrating with the echoes of their mockery. It's a harsh truth, so cruel it's like having a part of your body amputated. Have you ever realized that the person who hurt you is the only one who laughs while you're bleeding? I ponder the grim truth that the person who shattered your soul cannot be the one to mend it. Some people are not worth saving because they have already set fire to their own humanity. Looking back now, I should have stopped trying to heal a parasite that was only interested in the host's death. My name wasn't Maynard to them. It was a resource to be mined until the vein ran dry. I didn't realize it then, but the man who believed in redemption died in that basement tonight. A cold, righteous fury replaced the agony. I couldn't let that music box stay in that house. I couldn't let my daughter's room be the place where they toasted my destruction. I moved through the shadows of Savannah, my knowledge of the city's back alleys guiding me toward the penthouse. I wasn't there to hurt anyone. I was there to retrieve a piece of my soul. But Vespera had spent my money well on a high-tech security grid. As I approached the perimeter, a silent alarm must have tripped. I saw her through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She wasn't startled. She was prepared. She saw me, and instead of calling out, she began a performance that would finalize my erasure. I watched through the glass, paralyzed, as Vespera purposefully scratched her own arm with a letter opener. She tore her silk blouse at the collar, her eyes fixed on mine with a terrifying, blank intensity. She picked up the phone, her lips moving as she dialed the Savannah Police Department. I knew exactly what she was saying. My unstable ex-husband is here. He's broken in. He's attacking me. It was a violent defensive strike, a predator's way of finishing a wounded prey. Within minutes, the quiet street was flooded with the flashing blue and red lights of squad cars. The sirens wailed like banshees, echoing against the Spanish moss-draped trees. I had to run. I saw Rhett and Alara standing on the balcony, their faces pale under the spotlights of the police cruisers. They were looking down at the street with terror and a deep, visceral disgust. They saw their mother, disheveled and bleeding, and they saw me, the man they were told was a monster, lurking in the shadows. Their belief in her lies was the final death of my old, forgiving self. I was no longer a father in their eyes. I was a threat to be neutralized. The total collapse of my social standing was complete. I haven't been forgotten. I've been rebranded as a criminal. I narrowly escaped the phalanx of officers by slipping into the city's underground drainage tunnels. I designed the park system above them. I knew the veins of this city better than the police knew the streets. I waded through the cold, waist-deep water, the scent of stagnant earth and salt air filling my lungs. When I finally crawled back into my basement, I was soaked, shivering, and covered in the filth of the city. But my mind was a diamond, hard, clear, and sharp. I stopped crying. I wiped the mud from my face with a grit that surprised me. I was no longer the man who built gardens. I was the man who was going to deconstruct a conspiracy. I began pinning the evidence to a massive corkboard I had salvaged from a dumpster. The hospital blueprints, the forged bank statements, the glucose water labels, and finally, the recording of the mockery tape. It was my blueprint for reconstruction. Every piece of paper was a nail in the coffin of the lie Vespera had built. I looked at the board, the amber light of the basement casting long, jagged shadows against the wall. I wasn't a husband anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was the inspector, and the house Vespera was living in was officially condemned. I didn't realize it then, but that moment of absolute clarity was the most powerful I had ever felt. I picked up the phone, my fingers steady as I dialed a number I had avoided for a decade. The line rang 3 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered, a voice that carried the weight of the law and the coldness of a long-standing disappointment. "Judge Hutchins," I said, my voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration. "Dad, it's Maynard. I'm done being the dreamer. I'm ready to take back the Magnolia Land, and I'm going to need the full weight of the Hutchins name to do it." There was a long silence on the other end, a silence that felt like the shifting of tectonic plates. Then, my father spoke. "I've been waiting 10 years for you to stop apologizing for your heart, son. Tell me where you are." I hung up the phone and stared at the recording device, knowing the laughter I heard tonight would be the last thing they ever shared in freedom. The morning air outside the Savannah Historic Preservation Auction Hall was sharp, a rare chill cutting through the coastal humidity. I sat in the back of a black sedan, my hands resting on the steering wheel, knuckles white with a tension I hadn't felt in years. I am Maynard Hutchins, a man who has spent months in the shadows, and today, I was stepping back into the light. I checked my burner phone one last time. An encrypted message blinked on the screen, a signal from the one person Vespera never suspected, my daughter, Alara. Against the backdrop of her mother's betrayal, she had become my silent ally, the frequency of a father's truth finally overriding the static of a mother's lies. She had Len Gui, secretly sent, a screenshot of Garrick's private travel itinerary, and a hidden Swiss account login. They were planning to vanish the moment the gavel fell on the Magnolia Land. I adjusted the lapels of my suit. It was a high-quality navy wool, tailored to perfection, given to me by my father, Judge Athelstan. Slipping into it felt like reclaiming a discarded skin. The world had spent a year telling Alara I was a villain, a bankrupt ghost of a man, but her heart had held on to the truth I planted in her long ago. I reflected on the stoic reality that blood doesn't make a family. Integrity does. A child's trust is a sacred blueprint, and once you violate it, the entire structure is condemned. Have you ever wondered if the people you love can hear the truth, even when you aren't allowed to speak it? I didn't realize it then, but Alara's courage was the first stone in my new foundation. This was the moment the dreamer became the architect of justice. I stepped out of the car, the rhythmic thud of my father's cane on the pavement echoing like a heartbeat. Athelstan walked beside me, his presence a fortress of judicial weight. We approached the massive marble doors of the auction hall, the same place where my family had once been celebrated for their contributions to the city. Today, it was a stage for a heist. I adjusted my posture, feeling the weight of the evidence in my briefcase. I wasn't just walking into an auction, I was walking into a confrontation I had been preparing for in the silence of a basement apartment. Looking back now, I realized that every night of hunger was just a session of sharpening my resolve. We entered the hall, and the air immediately felt different, heavy with the scent of old paper and the hollow arrogance of the elite. Vesper and Garrick were in the front row, looking like a royal couple in their stolen opulence. My brothers Fergus and Alistair were flanking them, their faces set in grim expressions of misplaced loyalty. They still saw me as the liability, a broken man who had failed the Hutchkins name. As Athelstan and I walked down the center aisle, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. I felt the collective gaze of Savannah's high society, the whispers rising like a swarm of insects. I recalled the philosophical truth that justice is a slow-moving river, but it eventually grinds even the hardest stones into sand. I wasn't here to beg for my life. I was here to reclaim my honor. Fergus stepped into the aisle, his large frame attempting to block my path. "Maynard, you aren't supposed to be here," he hissed, his eyes darting toward the security guards. "You've done enough damage. Go back to your hole." I didn't flinch. I stood tall, my voice a low, steady vibration that carried a weight Fergus wasn't prepared for. But it was Athelstan who spoke first, his voice a gavel stroke that silenced the room. "Step aside, Fergus. You've spent a year listening to a serpent and calling it gospel. It's time you listen to the law." The judge's look was so sharp it could have cut glass. Fergus hesitated, his confidence flickering for the first time in years, and slowly moved aside. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. But I knew the era of the dreamer was over. The auctioneer took the podium, his voice droning on about the historic opportunity of the Magnolia Land. Vespera sat forward, a predatory smile playing on her lips. She was ready to sell the earth my mother rested in to fund a life in Bermuda with a man who had helped her fake a terminal illness. As the first bid was called, I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely unexpected. "This auction is over," I said, my voice cutting through the auctioneer's chant. I walked to the front and handed a set of documents to the clerk, a lis pendens, and a federal freeze order issued by the Southern District Court. I turned to face Vespera and Garrick, the hall lights reflecting in their wide-open eyes. It was an expression of utter horror, completely unconcealed, that had finally shattered their masks. I didn't shout. I spoke with a cold, calculated clarity that felt like a surgical strike. "You didn't just try to sell my house, Vespera," I said, the room so silent I could hear her sharp intake of breath. "You tried to sell the earth my mother rests in. With money you bled for my children's future. You conspired with this man to forge oncology reports and billing cycles for a medical wing that doesn't exist." I looked at my brothers, whose faces were turning an ashen gray. "And the lead bidder today? It's a shell corporation owned by Dr. Garrick. You were selling our family legacy to yourselves with the money you stole from me." The room erupted into chaos. Vespera stood up, her face twisted in a mask of rage, her voice a shrill scream of protest. "This is a lie. He's unstable. Alistair, Fergus, do something." But my brothers were frozen, staring at the federal seal on the documents in the auctioneer's hand. I realized then that a man is not measured by the property he owns, but by the legacy he is willing to die to protect. Vespera's power hadn't been real. It had been a structure built on the assumption of my silence. Now that I was speaking, her world was dissolving into the marble floors. I looked at her, one last time, with a profound pity. "The law doesn't negotiate with parasites, Vespera. It only eradicates them." I stood there, a pillar of stoic resolve, as the doors at the back of the hall burst open. A phalanx of federal agents entered, their movements precise and undeniable. Garrick tried to move toward the side exit, but he was intercepted before he could take 3 steps. Vespera's scream was cut short as she was surrounded. The high ceiling of the hall seemed to press down on them, the very architecture of Savannah finally turning against the people who had tried to manipulate it. I didn't feel a sense of revenge. I felt a sense of completion. The heritage ambush was a success, but the real work, the work of rebuilding, was only beginning. Have you ever felt the weight of a year's worth of pain lift off your shoulders in a single second? It's the most terrifyingly beautiful feeling in the world. The morning mist clung to the Savannah River like a lingering secret, but for the first time in a year, I could see right through it. I am Maynard Hutchkins, and I have learned that while a lie can build a grand palace, it lacks the structural integrity to survive the dawn. 2 weeks had passed since the ambush at the auction hall, and today I wasn't just an architect. I was a forensic examiner of a shattered conspiracy. I led a team of federal agents into Garrick's private clinic, moving through the sterile hallways with a cold, rhythmic purpose. The building felt different to me now. Not a place of healing, but a complex puzzle designed to hide a heist. Looking back now, I realized that the most dangerous traps are the ones we fund with our own hope. We reached the records room, a space lined with oak cabinets and the hum of high-end servers. I stopped in front of a load-bearing wall near the back office, running my hand along the wallpaper. Something didn't sit right. The architectural logic was flawed. The thickness of the wall didn't match the exterior supports I had studied in the city archives. I pointed to a specific seam near the molding. "Break it open," I said, my voice a low, steady vibration. The truth doesn't hide in the open. It hides in the spaces people think are too solid to question. This was the moment I stopped being the victim and became the demolitionist of their deceit. Federal agents expertly and efficiently breached the drywall, and the truth was revealed in a cloud of white dust. Behind the fake structure was a high-security safe and a series of files. Inside was the Black Book, a meticulous, detailed record of every fraudulent cancer report, every fake invoice for chemotherapy, with sugar water, and $5 million in laundered cash. It was the medical execution. I watched in silence as agents placed Vespera and Garrick in high-security restraints. Vespera's eyes met mine, her face a mask of pale, desperate shock, but I didn't feel the sting of her betrayal anymore. I only felt a clinical satisfaction. I realized then that a wall built to hide a secret is always the first one to crumble under the weight of its own darkness. The transition from the clinic to the Savannah courtroom felt like moving from a tomb into a cathedral. I stood before the bench as my father, Judge Athelstan, watched from the gallery, his face no longer set in disappointment, but in a quiet, judicial pride. The court moved with a speed that felt like a tidal wave, granting immediate emergency custody of my children and full restitution of every stolen asset. When I walked out into the hallway, Rhett and Alara were waiting. They ran to me, their tearful apologies spilling out like a broken dam. I held them close, breathing in the scent of their hair. But when I pulled back, I spoke with the firm wisdom of a man who had walked through fire. "I don't need your apologies for believing a lie," I said, my voice steady. "I only need your courage to live the truth from this day forward. We don't look back, we rebuild." I returned to the gates of the Magnolia estate, the iron bars feeling light under my hand. My brothers, Fergus and Alistair, were standing there, their faces etched with a shame that no amount of money could fix. They expected me to shout, to cast them out as they had done to me. Instead, I handed them a set of legal papers, a formal severance of our business ties. "I'm not holding a grudge," I told them, my voice devoid of malice but as hard as granite. "But forgiveness isn't about inviting the poison back into your house. It's about making sure the house is strong enough that the poison can never enter again. You chose the serpent over your brother. Now you may choose another path, but it will not be on this land." This is the solid foundation for my new life. The sun began to crest over the horizon as I walked to the edge of the property where my mother rests. I had spent the last week restoring her headstone, the very one I had been forced to sell during the treatment. I ran my fingers over the engraved letters, feeling a sense of homecoming that transcended property deeds. The family soul had returned. I announced right there, to the quiet morning air, the creation of the Hutchkins Trust. It wouldn't be a hedge fund for profit, but a foundation dedicated to providing legal and architectural aid to families devastated by medical fraud. I realized that the best way to honor a legacy is to use its ruins to build a shelter for others. Have you ever found that your greatest purpose was born from your greatest pain? I called Rhett over to a corner of the porch where a new support beam was being set. I handed him the level, teaching him the same lessons my grandfather taught me. "Men build with stone and wood, Rhett," I said, looking out at the Savannah River. "But legacies are built with integrity." A house can be burned to the ground, but a man's character is fireproof. Remember that when the world tries to tell you who you are." He nodded, his eyes bright with a new kind of respect. We weren't just fixing a porch, we were anchoring a bloodline. I didn't realize it then, but the youngest son had finally become the pillar of the era. The final shot of the morning was expansive, the camera of my mind panning over the river, where the golden light hit the water. I stood on the porch with Athelstan and my children, the shadow of the man I used to be completely gone. I wasn't the dreamer who let people walk over him. I was the architect who knew exactly where to place the stones. I looked at the horizon where the river met the sky, finally understanding that the hardest winter of my life had only been the season that prepared me for an eternal spring. The darkness was over. The house was solid. The truth was home.